Okay, coming up next is now Dr. Steve Tetreault, and he's going to give us a fascinating presentation that deals with book shaming, and you're going to really love this. I have heard this before. So I have just made you the host, so hopefully
Awesome.
you'll be able to share.
Let's see. There we go. Sweet. Let's do that. Let's share.
Love the shirt, man.
Oh yeah, got to represent. We're talking about books. Whoops, I
That's
am
right.
on the last slide instead of the first slide. So let's go back to the beginning. So, yeah, hey everybody. First, I want to thank Casey so much for putting all of this together. This is absolutely amazing. She is such an inspiration and such a mover and shaker. And thank you so much. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks to Every Library and Wakelet for sponsoring, Macmillan's Children Publishing Group for some nice behind the scenes stuff. We really appreciate all of that. So we've got 60 slides and we've got 25 minutes. So we're going to be moving fast. And at the end of this presentation will be the bit.ly link and the QR code so you can get to the slides. I'm going to kind of go quickly through some stuff, but all the data is here so you can always come back and check it out. Okay, so let's talk about how we're going to reignite our love of reading in our students and how we can end literacy shaming. So this presentation that you're seeing right now is actually based on some stuff, some conversations and a presentation that I did with Amanda Jones and Wendy Prey, who are amazing and awesome. And that's actually on YouTube. You can find that. You can check it out. The link is here if you want to check it out later. And it's just we're going to not do that. We're going to do this instead. You don't care who I am, but I want to just point out that I was a teacher of English for 20 plus years before I became a school librarian. And I was known as the toughest teacher in the school. So that's going to be relevant to where we're going here. Now, before we get to where I want to go, I want you to imagine for a second, okay? You are a student at a dance school, okay? You don't have a choice about this. You have to go to dance school. And the teachers want you to dance. And in order to get better at dancing, you're going to have to practice on your own, okay? So they say, we want you to dance, so go ahead and start dancing. So you break out your absolute best dance moves. And you are shaking it and you are moving it. And people are staring at you going, really? Seriously? That's what you're doing? Come on. You call that dancing? That's not real dancing. Come on. You should be doing real dancing. Come on, step it up. Imagine how you would feel if you were there and you were forced to go to dance school and then you got made fun of for sharing your version of dancing rather than getting constructive criticism or even somebody taking you and saying, that's awesome. And let's see if we can refine that a little bit. Or, oh man, that reminds me of this, right? So let's have that image in our head. And let's think for a second about what is your guilty pleasure read? We've all got them, or we all had them at some point. Some of us have gotten past it. I will tell you what mine is in a minute. It could be a genre that you're like, oh, I don't like to tell people I like to read this. Or it could be a format that you're like, nah, people don't really think of that. I don't want to tell them about that. Or maybe there's like a specific book that you're like, oh, I'd never want people to know that I actually read this and like this. What is your guilty pleasure read? Okay. Now, this has to do with literacy shaming. So my journey to understanding literacy shaming started with Twilight and Twitter because somebody posted, what's your guilty pleasure read? And I kind of shamefacedly admitted that Twilight was a real guilty pleasure for me. Like first I resisted it when it first came out, and then all my students were reading it. So I had to check it out. And when I did, I was so sucked in by it. Now, okay, we're looking back on it now. There's lots of problematic stuff going on in Twilight. We can all acknowledge that. But at the time, I read it, I loved it, and I was embarrassed to tell anybody. I did not want anybody to know this. And in thinking about why I was embarrassed to talk about this, I was like, why should I be embarrassed to say that I like to read? Because my handle is Dr. T Loves Books. I always talk about loving to read. So why should I say that this one particular piece of reading is an embarrassment to me? It's kind of silly. And when I was seeing the titles that people were sharing for what their guilty pleasure was, I was like, I loved that. That was great. Why would that be a guilty pleasure? And I started to realize that we've kind of built up a couple of structures and a couple of accepted practices in schools and sometimes in libraries where we make people feel bad for reading. And we may not think we're doing it. I did this for years. So we're talking about literacy shaming, which is any action that's going to discourage someone from reading what they want to read. It could be verbal, like maybe you hear somebody say, oh, read a real book, don't read that. Or read at your level. You're reading that? Could even be nonverbal. Now, I don't think teachers are pointing and laughing or school librarians are pointing and laughing, but students are. Sometimes they'll see a kid with a particular book, like, oh, that's what you're reading? I do middle school and high school. And when those kids borrow the Diary of a Wimpy Kid books, sometimes their friends point and laugh. Oh, you're reading that garbage? Ugh. Or we limit access to desired reading material, sending books on book vacations. Now, I know there are people who want to come through the screen right now and bop me on the nose, but stick with me, okay? There's three main kinds of literacy shaming, I think. There's the unintentional or the well-meaning literacy shaming. And that's what I think a lot of parents and teachers and school librarians do without even realizing you're doing it, making someone feel bad about their reading choices or their skills in an effort to help them improve. We think we're helping them, right? Then there's the unaware literacy shaming, which is when there's some teasing going on that involves or includes referencing somebody's reading choices or their reading skills. That day in class in 7th grade, when one of my classmates was reading aloud and was not a big read aloud person, and he was telling us about how when the battle was raging, it was utter chouse. And the whole class cracked up. And that became a joke for the rest of the school year that this kid had to endure. Every time somebody was going to read, they would make sure they worked the word chouse or chaos into what they were talking about. And that kid had to endure that. How do you think that made him feel about his reading? We've got purposeful literacy shaming, purposely trying to make people feel bad because of philosophical disagreements about what should be read. I bet that made your antenna go, wait a minute, that seems very familiar. Yeah, right? So we're going to come back to all these. Now, the unaware literacy shaming is pretty easy to deal with, right? Maybe it's friendly teasing, maybe it's bullying. Bullying, not super easy to deal with, but like we can do stuff to overcome that relatively easily, right? Because it's not really about reading, it's more about the reader, right? And we may not realize we're even doing it because we want people to read, but maybe we need to work on bullying prevention or social emotional instruction, building empathy, thinking about how we're talking to students about what they're reading or how we're talking to other adults about what students are reading, right? And I think a lot of times just being aware of it is going to make a big difference. So we've also got the unintentional or the well-intentioned literacy shaming. This is the group where teachers and parents tend to fall into. And I said, I include myself in this because I absolutely did this and it's a huge problem. So we want readers. That is one of our main goals of school. Like no matter what subject you're in, no matter what grade you're in, but too often our behavior about student reading is more like beatings will continue until morale improves. You're going to read until you like to read. And you're going to read the things I tell you to read, and then you're going to love it. And it's like, So we got to think about how we're approaching this, because I did this. These are things I did, right? I thought I was helping when I directed kids away from their choices and tried to push them into reading like classics. I had so many parents come to me and say, I want my kid to read classics. Or I would say, why don't you try this classic? There's nothing wrong with a classic, but trying to force someone to like it, I don't know that that's a great way to build up reading interest, right? Sometimes we don't allow kids to read graphic novels or books that were too easy. Again, I did this. I used to do this with my students, or strongly voicing my opinions about books I didn't like for whatever reason it was. I'd be like, oh, yeah, I read that. I really hated it. It was pretty bad. Who cares what I thought? If the kid likes it, that's what matters, right? And I would do this all the time. I would steer books to kids I loved when I was their age. Be like, oh my gosh, when I was in middle school, I loved this book. I'm old. They are young. They don't care what I was reading when I was their age, right? Here's the thing. We know that reading enjoyment is linked with literacy achievement. The more kids like to read, the better they do on reading assessments. So we want them to want to read. We want to get them to read. Wanting to read correlates with doing well on assessments of reading. We know this. There's research. And yet, there was a study of reading practices over the course of some time. And we see that like from 1984 to 2012, we had 9-year-olds lost a little bit of ground between 1984 and 2012 in time spent on reading, right? 13-year-olds had a bigger drop, and 17-year-olds had a huge drop in time spent on reading from 1984 to 2012. Now, part of that is that there's lots of other stuff going on, but also part of it is we haven't always been very helpful in getting students the things they want to read and encouraging their reading interests. So I think as school librarians particularly, it is so important to think about how can we support those students, right? Now, again, something I did, reading accountability, right? We as a school, as teachers, as educators, as school librarians, we often feel like we have to have some sort of accountability measures to make sure kids are doing what we ask them to do, right? We need to, if they're not reading, we're not doing our job. Well, the things we often do for accountability often just get in the way of kids wanting to read, right? Requiring a log of reading. Who is that really helping? Like it's really kind of busy work. And unless the kid is interested in journaling about what they're reading, it's really just taking time away that they could be spending reading, or it's stopping them from, you have to stop every 10 pages before you go on. If I told you you had to stop every 10 minutes in the movie you're watching so you could write about it, would you be down with that? Would that make you enjoy the movie more? And I'm not saying that there aren't places for these practices, but I think overall we have overemphasized them and over-relied on them, right? Accelerated reader, other kinds of programs like that, right? We say, oh, well, this is going to show that they're reading. Is it? It's showing that they can take a test. And so many kids will pick the shortest possible book, or they will share answers. And it doesn't really help them actually engage with and like reading. It's a process that they have to go through rather. Scores and levels are diagnostics. They're not straitjackets saying, oh, your level is Q, and so you can only read books off the Q shelf. Why? Why would we stop them? If they want to read something that's less advanced, we know they're going to be able to take it in. If they want to read something that's more advanced, why would we want to get in their way? Like we might want to say, if you like that topic, here's a book on a similar topic, maybe take both of them, but don't. I think it's a mistake to try and say, you can't read that thing. And a lot of these scores and levels and diagnostics and accelerator reader and these kind of programs that kids do rely on, they have all these big claims about how they improve student achievement. But when you look at the fine print, they're all about fidelity, as long as they are applied with fidelity. And there is no way in a school setting to apply any of this stuff with fidelity, and definitely not the way it's getting applied, right? Getting applied exactly the same way to every student in exactly the same setting. It's not happening. It's BS. So we got to think about that, right? And the problem is literacy shaming really hurts our kids. It hurts their self-image as a reader. Because when you say if I say, that's not a book. Why don't you read a real book? What I'm telling them is their choice as a reader is not valid. And so they are not a reader. That's pretty harmful. It hurts their sense of self-efficacy, their ability to say, I am good at this. It hurts their ability to say, I am a reader and I can pick out reading that makes sense, right? So we've got to think about these things. A lot of times people will talk about, oh, this kid's just not a reader. I don't know if I buy that. Personally, I think they're a myth. Reluctant readers, maybe they don't like picking up books for a lot of the reasons we've just been talking about. Do they not feel comfortable reading? Probably. We don't give them the time, the space, or literally the physical space to be comfortable with their reading. And maybe they haven't found the reading material that really works for them. If we can help them connect, that might do the trick. So somebody is asking a question about teachers, and I'm going to get there. In fact, I'm getting there now. So here's the thing. Teachers have a lot of expectations on them, and they talk about accountability, right? Teachers are supposed to account for every minute of the class, and if they're not doing something to improve the student scores, then they feel like they're under pressure, right? So we've got to try and help them understand that kids develop. And I know they know that intellectually, but sometimes it's easy to forget, right? It doesn't matter if what a kid is reading is below or above their level, or if what they read, they've read before and they're going to read it over and over and over again, because as they grow, they're going to change. Their interests are going to change. Their abilities are going to change. If we can just get them to want to read, their scores will go up. Their interest will go up. We need to get out of their way. And so I've got pictures of kids here, and I've got Spidermans and Peschetti and magazines, right? These are words that kids often get wrong. Spidermans, my little nephews, when they were just starting to talk, each morning, they would run down to the kitchen when we would go to visit my family. They'd run down to the kitchen and they'd say, "Oh, it's time for Spidermans. It's time for Spidermans." And my brother-in-law would say, "No, they're vitamins. Say vitamins." And he would stop and correct them until they said it the right way. And I'm like, dude, they're not going to grow up and be 40-year-olds asking for Spidermans at the pharmacy, right? Like, I think we can let that go. They're going to grow. They're going to come out of it. Let's just enjoy the fact that they are excited and enjoying, right? Rather than turning it into a coercion or correction. So we can also remind the teachers that are doing these kinds of things that reading has all these different benefits. And this is linked right to this study, but the key points are, there's a whole bunch of different studies that show that reading increases blood flow to their brain, which means they're going to be thinking more and better. It improves their writing. It exercises their memory. It increases empathy, which I personally think is a huge thing we could use more of these days. And it also expands vocabulary, especially graphic novels. Now, here's where you can go to your teachers. We all have seen this, right? The more they read, the more words they get, and that's good. But here is a graphic. Nope, I'm not there yet. So, okay, I'll come back to that in a second. And the thing is, a lot of times we might be doing this unconsciously. I was at the School Library Journal Summit this past year, and a speaker was talking about how important it is to get certain books into kids' hands because they may not even know that they may not see themselves. And if they can see themselves in reading, that makes a huge difference. And she was talking about this particular book, Some Girls Bind. And she was saying that for some students, it made literally a life and death difference for them, that they were able to connect with a character and understand themselves in a new way because of what they read in this book. And talking about the book, this speaker who said this is an incredibly important book for students, for certain students, said this book may not be great literature, but it's important to students. And I'm going to submit, who cares if it's great literature? There's a former English teacher saying this, okay? Hold on. Don't throw the slings and arrows just yet, okay? If we want kids to read, we cannot say the only thing you can read is great literature, because that carries so many assumptions and connotations, right? So we've got to say, we want you to find the reading that is important to you, whether it's books, whether it's magazines, whether it's whatever it is, because reading is important. We can talk to the librarians to work together to support students with curriculum materials or support materials for the curriculum that students will enjoy that aren't necessarily the class novel alone, right? Like, what can we find that might go with that to help the teachers have a resource that they can go to say, oh, we're reading this, and here's a couple of things that maybe you'd be interested in. Like, here's a graphic novel version. Here's a verse novel that's on a similar topic. Here's a different book with a similar message. And helping the students find the things that they can enjoy that maybe they're being forced to make their way through as part of class, right? So we can take a little bit of that load off the teacher's shoulders and reinforce what they're doing in the classroom, right? Getting cross-disciplinary. It's so easy. I do this all the time. I think ELA teachers are my audience, and it's not just ELA teachers. I've got to look beyond those ELA teachers and kind of say there's lots of ways that there's really interesting stuff to read about in all these subjects. There's some amazingly interesting stories about math and how if you don't do math right, buildings fall down, right? But do we talk to the math teachers about that? Do we bring them those kinds of things? If we can do that, we can help the teachers help us, and we can help the teachers help the students, right? Remind teachers and administrators that more reading leads to better test scores. And this is not just made up, like this is facts. We can bring them research that says when we get out of their way and let them read, they do better. And another person I heard at the School Library Journal Summit this past year was Superintendent Mike Daria of Tuscaloosa City Schools. And he was talking about when he started, he had to be talked into the importance of student reading being them enjoying their reading. And they instituted in his district student happiness as a data point. Think about that. If student happiness is a data point and we encourage students to read what they want, and we make finding joy in reading a data point, what a powerful data point that is. Because when kids want to read, when they want to learn, instead of having to force feed them as we go, amazing, right? So to talk about some of these ideas, I made a couple of PSAs. You are more than welcome to use them, share them, remake them in your own image, whatever works for you. They're 1 or 2 minutes long each. There's 3 of them. There's a little playlist on YouTube you'll be able to click through. I'm going to skip past them for now because we're getting a little short on time, but there's one about genres and reading levels and just letting folks find their own genre and reading level. There's one about adult reading expectations and how we need to kind of get out of kids' ways. And there's one about boy books and girl books. Did you know that books have genitals? No, they don't. So those are out there. You can check them out. So another thing we can do to help teachers kind of overcome some of their hangups, building reading culture, right? And there's so many things we can do about that. We need to remind teachers and students that picture books count as reading. Middle grade and YA is reading. Adult books, depending on the level of student, is reading. We want our teachers to read. Like, we want to encourage the teachers to be part of our reading community. Audiobooks, they activate the same parts of the brain as text, graphic novels, whatever. There's so many different things that we can find. And there's this great little clip from Justin Reynolds that we're going to skip past for the moment because we're getting real short on time. But we need to remind folks, teachers, students, our community, that reading, it can be a social activity. I think a lot of people think of reading as you sit in a room quietly by yourself. And yes, that's maybe part of reading, but there's also a lot of social activities that we can bring to reading, right? Read alouds. Could be the adults reading to students. It could be students reading to students. It could be, I heard somebody talk about doing a contest for the best character voices in a book. What a great way to get the kids. They're going to have to know something about what goes on in the book in order to do that, right? So like, you could have fun little things like that. Building up kind of book clubs that could be talking about the same book, because think about, I mean, a lot of adults love to be part of book clubs. And one of the biggest parts of the book club is just talking with people. And it's not always even just about the text of the book. It's often about the ideas of the book. And isn't that what we want students talking about? They don't even have to read all the same book. You could have a genre reading club and they talk about a genre that they like, and then they're getting book ideas as they go, right? Book talks, you can do them live, you can do them on video, you can just have podcast versions. It could be students doing it, it could be teachers doing it could be you doing it. There's so many already out there, right? So there's so many ways to get people to engage with book talks or book tastings, just putting groups of books together that students can go and kind of read a couple of pages and then tell them to move on, right? So when we give students choice, it gives them ownership. And that's going to improve their self-efficacy, their feeling that they are being effective at what they're doing. And it gives them agency. It gives them control over their learning, which is so important, right? We've got to encourage students and teachers to let go of their preconceived notions of what a reader has to be. Because I love this. Jarrett Lerner does amazing graphics. His were the first on the first slide. His were the first graphics that were there. And this one he made that I put copies of around my school. To be a reader, you do not have to read every day. You don't have to read quickly. You don't have to read certain books. You don't have to already read certain books or have read certain books. You don't have to finish every book you start. When I tell students, if you don't like it, stop reading it, they look at me like, well, what is this concept? Like, they can't wrap their mind around it. Why would we make a kid read a book they don't like? That's a great way to make them hate reading, right? Audiobooks, we've got lots of studies on it. Each one of these words that is underlined is a separate study about how audiobooks are working in our brains, basically identically to prose, right? Graphic novels, I was coming back to this. So I talked about vocabulary, right? Another series of Jarrett Lerner graphics that he loves to share out. Comic books average 53.5 rare words per 1,000. Children's books average 30.9. Here's the kicker. Adult books average 52.7 rare words per 1,000. So comic books actually have more rare words. They can help students build up a better vocabulary. It's from a study. Bring it to the teachers. Look, this is not something we can ignore. Oh man. Okay. So book banning, and literacy shaming. So we know that there are trolls out there. There's toxic fandom. There's book censorship. There's book bans. Don't say gay bills. There's so many things. And as far as a solution, there's not an easy one. But one thing we've got to remember is we can't be neutral, because no one's personal preferences matter more than our students' needs for information, right? We've got to think about age relevance. Get rid of the words age appropriate, because appropriate carries the connotation of polite, of something you talk about at dinner. But our kids need information about relevant topics that may be uncomfortable to talk about or learn about, but that can be very important for them, right? So wherever you can, move away from age appropriate, move into age relevant. We know more reading leads to better outcomes, better reading scores, but also better social emotional health and better sexual health and safety. And as a school librarian once told me, if they're in on a Friday night, if students are in on a Friday night reading about it, they're not out on a Friday night doing it. I really, really like that one. There's some more stuff here, but I'm going to skip ahead. So there's lots of great groups. There's lots of great resources that are in here. There's reasons that representation matters so much. There's a couple of extra things here, but I'm out of time. These are Jarrett Lerner's posters. They've got links to his art. I hope you will check them out. If you want to get in touch with me, here's me. And if you want to check out these slides and be able to go through the links and stuff, here's the bit.ly, here's the QR. I think I got the question, and I love that Nicole said, my guilty pleasure was Pamela Anderson's biography. In general, I'm usually embarrassed to admit I like to read bio or memoir of people who aren't necessarily enhancing my craft as a librarian. I'm just curious and nosy of celebrities. Most people deem it as useless info, but for some odd reason, I enjoy reading about people's lives, especially if their lives are so far removed from mine. Think about the message there. Like that's a great message, because when we look at people's lives who are very different than ours, it gives us a point of comparison. It gives us a way to relate to people in a different way. It builds empathy. It helps us see different parts of the world than we might otherwise have seen, right? So there's so many great reasons that you absolutely should read books about people that are different than you. It shouldn't just be all school librarians. I think that's all I got. Any other thoughts, questions, concerns that you want to toss this way?
I see a question. How do you facilitate changing minds of the teachers you work with who continue to tout the practices we have discarded?
Yeah, so definitely we want to talk to them about there's relevant material for our students. Mm-hmm. There is good research that shows here's why we should be encouraging them to read graphic novels, why we should encourage them to consider audiobooks as real books. Like, show them the research, like bring them, this is factual stuff. This is not just stuff that's made up.
Right.
And find ways that we can help them build that reading culture as we go.
Well, the one about the slide about the graphic novels and the vocabulary.
Yeah.
I want to use that one at my back to school professional development for the teachers and the PTO. So you gave me a great idea, because some of them feel a certain kind of way about the graphic novels, but and this spells it out.
Yeah, and it's based on research. Like, it's not, this is just something somebody made up. Like, you can show them, and you can give them the link to the study, so it's hard for them to fight back when you're saying, I am helping you improve your students' test scores.
It's hard for them to fight back when you explain to them that there's over 30 years of research in library information science, specifically for school libraries. Boom.
Yeah.
And so that kind of takes them off, but it goes back into that old stereotype and thinking that they know everything about school libraries, but they don't. But anyway, I'm not going to get on my soapbox. Thank you so much. I know that was a lot that you packed in 30
jam some in
28 minutes. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We're going to leave the screen up for just a second. So if you didn't catch how you can get in contact with Dr. Steve, there it is. And of course, there's going to be another one pager that will be shared tomorrow, that you'll be able to catch. So just want you guys to see that. All right, up next is Deb Zeman. She is our representative with Wakelet.